Well, Abbot James and everybody, thank you so much for that. And that video was beautifully done. All the videos are beautifully done, aren't they? I want to applaud the people involved in that. Terrific. Terrific. You know, on the way in today from the airport, I was with Abbot James, and I said, now, how long do you want me to talk? And he said, oh, you know, I think like a half hour. And I said, oh, gosh, a half hour seems awfully long. And he goes, well, we did fly you in, you know, so I won't talk a half hour, believe me. I'm always reminded when I have an after-dinner speaking obligation, this is many years ago, probably 20 years ago in Chicago, a room very much like this. It was the gathering of all the priests, the convocation. And the priests had the cocktail hour and a half, right? And then we all gathered like this, and they served steak and wine. And so about 8 o'clock, out comes the featured speaker, who was Cardinal Carlo Martini, who was the Archbishop of Milan, very prominent churchman. And he got up, and here, this room like this, filled with Chicago priests, have been drinking and eating steak and wine. And he proceeded to give this very heavy academic speech, right? Long thing, in heavily accented English. So by 8:10, I would say, a third of the room was snoring, right? Actively, loudly, unmistakably snoring. Well, anyway, we get through that night. The next morning, the MC of the event was a kind of a wag, a Chicago priest, and he said, well, that was a dry martini. So I'm always reminded of the dry martini when I speak after dinner. I promise I won't speak very long. I just want to do two simple things. The first one is to pay tribute to Benedictines and what they've meant to me. I'll tell you exactly how the Benedictine world first entered my life. I was 16 years old. I was working at a little bookstore outside Chicago called Crocs and Brentanos. My brother was also there working. He was 17. And there was a policy, if a book cover got sort of tattered, the manager allowed us to, rip it off and we could keep the book. So my brother had this book and he threw it at me and it landed in my lap. I remember it vividly. He said, here's a book I think you would like. It's by a Trappist monk. And I said in my 16-year-old wisdom, I don't want to read a book by some Buddhist. He said, Trappists are Catholics, you idiot. And with that, he threw into my lap Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain. And I was 16, and of course, you know that book. It's a great book about someone really falling in love with God. And it's told in a great romantic way. And when you're 16, that's the way you take things in. And that book had a huge impact on me and my vocation. And it opened up for me this great Benedictine world. Well, I ended up going to Fenwick High School outside Chicago for 1 year, Dominicans, and then 3 years at Benedict Academy, a great Benedictine high school. So St. Procopius Abbey I came to know. And then just before my ordination to the priesthood, I went on retreat to St. Meinrad Arch Abbey in southern Indiana. I'll never forget it. I remember the first morning, I'm walking toward the great monastic church. Very early, it was still dark, misty morning. I found my way to the side door, entered, I can still see it vividly, this beautifully illumined interior. The monks gathered, and then they began to chant the Psalms. And I'll never forget it. And it shaped me and turned things around. And it made me really fall in love with the Benedictine form of life. The 3 years after that, in my priesthood, I always did my retreat at St. Meinrad to be close to those monks. Then I was sent for doctoral studies over to Paris, and every year, at least once, sometimes twice, I went on retreat, always to a Benedictine house. I went to Bec-à-Louin, I went to Solesmes, I went to Citeaux, the great monastery of St. Bernard himself. I went to Tamier, the Trappist monastery. It was always the Benedictines that called me back. And then throughout my priesthood, typically when I got back home, I would go on retreat to Meinrad, or I'd go to St. Procopius, or I'd go to Marmion Abbey. The Benedictines kept singing to me. And so I accept the award tonight very much in the spirit of gratitude to this great abbey of St. Benedict's, but also all the Benedictine communities and houses that have really touched me and shaped me. So that's the first thing, to thank the Benedictine world for that. Now, here's the second thing I want to talk to you about. Evangelization. So you caught from the video that it's been a lifelong preoccupation of mine. And what the popes have been calling the new evangelization, I've sort of made that the center of my work. I'll tell you really how it started. I think Archbishop Jim, if he's still here, remembers this Chicago priest, Monsignor Wayne Prist, just had his 50th anniversary, by the way, a few weeks ago. This is about 1998 or 99. I was out with him for lunch. And I was teaching at the seminary at the time, and I was writing books and that sort of thing. But I was also grousing to him about how we Catholics are behind the curve when it comes to the media. And our Protestant friends are doing so many creative things, and what are we doing? And Fulton Sheen was the pioneer, and then we dropped the ball, and I'm going on and on. And finally, he looked at me and said, well, what are you doing about it? And I said, well, I'm teaching at the seminary, and I'm writing books. And he goes, well, then you stop complaining. Well, that was a trigger for me. And I went from that to WGN Radio in Chicago, big radio station. And I said, I'm just curious, what would it cost to have a little sermon program on the radio? And they said, well, we got a really good time, 5:15 Sunday morning, and for $50,000, we'll get you on for the year. So okay. And I went to the parish I was helping out at, and I told them exactly that story. And they gave me the money. And that's how we started, was 5:15 a.m. I discovered a lot of truckers listened to the radio at that time. But that's how it got going. And the miracle of it really, as I look back, is in the course of those maybe 20-some years, the people began to be attracted to the mission. And I think that's the way it always works in the church. When a mission is in the spirit of the gospel, people are attracted to it. And so Word on Fire, my media ministry, began to grow. And it was dedicated to new evangelization. Now, here's some stats I want to share with you, just to give you an idea of why we need this work. Do you know this category now they use of the nuns? And I don't mean women religious. I mean the NONES. So this means people who, when they check off what's your religion, they don't say Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Jew. They say none. I don't have religion. In the most recent Pew Forum study, you know what the figure was for our country? 25% of Americans now say none. I have no religion. You know what the figure was when I was a kid back in the 70s? It was 3%. And that was my experience. I mean, the whole country was religious of some kind back in the 70s. Now, 1/4 of our country says no religion. And among the young, it's worse. Those 30 and younger, you know what the number is? 40% claim to have no religion. That's the future, of course. Among Catholics, 30 and younger, it's even worse. 50% claim no religion. Now, what this is, everybody, what it ought to be, is a major league wake-up call. That what the popes have been calling for, what Vatican II called for, is still urgently necessary, which is a new evangelization of the culture. We ought not to presume that somehow, everybody's religious, or, the Christian story, everyone knows that. Increasingly, they don't, especially among the young. And so we've got to get in the front lines. I mean, all of us. Listen to Pope Francis, by the way, that we're all missionary disciples. So disciples we get, we're followers of Jesus. But we're missionary disciples on a mission to announce the gospel. I'll tell you the two things that have animated the work that Word on Fire has tried to do. The beauty of Catholicism and the smartness, the truth of Catholicism. I think both those things are evangelically compelling. Beauty, first of all, beauty. In our culture today, if you talk about the true and the good, people tend to get very defensive very fast, don't they? Hey, I got the truth. Oh, who are you to tell me what's true? You got your truth, I got mine. Don't impose your values on me. Or in our culture today, even worse, if you say, hey, I know the way you ought to be behaving. Oh, everybody's defenses go up, right? But somehow I think when you start with the beautiful, it's more winsome. It awakens less defensiveness among people. If you say, look, I'm not telling you how to think or how to behave, I just am asking you to look. Just look. Look at the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Look at the San Chapelle. Look, just read Dante's Divine Comedy, as we heard. Just look at the work of Mother Teresa's sisters in Calcutta. Beauty works its way into the soul. It changes you, doesn't it? And see, here's the thing, everybody. Catholicism is a beautiful religion. It's one of our virtues, one of our marks. We've not turned away from the beautiful. We've embraced it over the centuries. Sculpture and painting, drama, literature, the arts, and I would say Benedictine monks chanting the Gregorian chant, chanting the Psalms up and down the centuries. It's that beauty that has beguiled civilizations. Continues to. It continues to. It beguiled me that misty morning long ago at St. Meinrad's, and it stayed to this day in my heart. So I think we evangelize through the beauty of our tradition. Secondly, as I mentioned, Catholicism is a smart religion. And we should revel in that, not underplay it. Honestly, my generation that came of age after Vatican II, we experienced a kind of dumbed-down Catholicism. Do you know what I mean? I think of that time as the banners and balloons Catholicism, right? The way I was trained in religion class. A rather superficial, not very intellectually compelling version of the faith. And you know what that has been, in my judgment? That's been a pastoral disaster. Because see, a lot of people in my generation that received a very flat, superficial version of Catholicism, once we grew up and we faced life, with all of its challenges and all of its ups and downs, this very superficial religion was not enough to feed us, mind or soul. And a lot of people, my generation, left. The nuns today, the NONES, it's a lot of people who were formed in a very superficial Catholicism. We're a smart religion, and we ought to savor that. It's one of the great virtues, isn't it, of the Benedictine tradition, which re-civilized Europe. At a time when there was a civilizational collapse, it was the Benedictine movement, precisely by preserving the great literature of the ancient world, preserving the Bible, preserving the church fathers, that re-civilized Europe. And so today, I do believe we need a revival of our Catholic intellectual tradition. Here's something, by the way, from that Pew Forum study I mentioned with all the nuns. They asked the nuns, how come you left? You know what the number one reason is? It's very interesting to me. It was not the sex abuse scandal. That was in there, but it was not number one. The number one reason that young people especially say they're leaving the church is that science disproves religion. You can't be a reasonable person and a person of faith. Right? I mean, I tear my hair out when I hear that's the number one reason you're leaving. And here we are, everybody, in our Catholic tradition, faith and reason. The Archbishop said it in his prayer, faith and reason. Science does not stand to thwart the faith. And that's why, by the way, I can't see with the bright lights here, but anyone in this room involved in the sciences, I mean physicians and chemists and physicists and those who teach the sciences especially, can I urge all of you to get in the front lines of this fight? Because our young people, believe me, they are buying this nonsense that somehow science is antipathetic to religion. Our own Catholic scientists need to get, I think, in the front lines of that battle. I'll give you one example of this. the revival of our intellectual tradition. This was about, 7 or 8 years ago. I was at my Word on Fire office in Chicago. And a young lady who worked with us came in with her daughter that day. Her daughter was 9 at the time. And she said, her name was Josie. Josie, show Father Bob how much you know about Star Wars, right? And like a lot of little kids, they love the Star Wars story. Well, this kid, 9 years old, begins to recount for me the whole thing. You know what I mean? Not just, I know Luke Skywalker and, Obi-Wan Kenobi and some of the basics. She was way behind. She was giving me every subplot, the prequel, the sequel, the whole thing, rattling off these wild names. Well, as she was telling the story, I'm just smiling. Because here's what I'm thinking. How many times have I heard people say, the kids today, they could never understand the Bible. I mean, it's just too complicated. These long stories and these weird names. I'm thinking, this kid, she's got Lando Calrissian and Obi-Wan Kenobi. She can handle Nebuchadnezzar, you know what I mean? But what struck me was, here's this kid, 9 years old. Her mind is on fire with this story. Loves it, loves the detail of it, loves the complexity of it. How come, pardon this sort of cri de coeur I'm giving you, but, our high school kids, they can be they're reading Hamlet in English class, and they're doing Einstein in science, and they're reading Virgil in Latin class, and then we often give them comic books for religion. Why do we so underestimate what our kids are capable of? And then are we surprised that they say you can't be religious and smart? You can't be religious and scientific. Here's one thing, by the way, I tell all my science teacher friends. Find the biggest picture you can of Georges Lemaitre. Do you know who he is? Georges Lemaitre was the formulator of the Big Bang theory of cosmic origins. So back in the mid-20th century, he's giving us this theory. And it was very controversial. In fact, Einstein, who was a friend of Georges Lemaitre, didn't believe it. Well, now, of course, everyone believes, everyone accepts the Big Bang theory. Well, who was Georges Lemaitre? Scientist? Yeah. He was also a Catholic priest. In fact, in all the pictures of Lemaitre, he's got this huge Roman collar, like a dog collar. And I've said to the science people, get that picture and put it up in your science classroom. Don't let the kids believe this nonsense about science refuting religion. We're a beautiful tradition. We're a smart tradition. And where both of those things are found is in the Benedictine tradition, right? I mean, at its best, think of the beauty of chant. Think of the wonder of preserving ancient and Christian civilization. That's the beauty of it. That's the wonder of it. That's the power of it. We all got to be missionary disciples. We got to be in the front lines of this fight for the future of the church. See, that's really why I'm delighted to accept this award, simply as a way of honoring the Benedictine tradition and encouraging all of us to see it as an inspiration for our own missionary discipleship. So again, thanks everybody for coming tonight. Thank you for your support of St. Benedict's, and thanks for this honor. God bless you all.